Okay, here we are, ready to roll. Chapter 19, entitled An Enemy. Watchful was standing at the door of the lodge when little Christian came out of the palace. When he was opening the gates, he told Christian that another boy pilgrim had passed by. I asked him his name, said the porter, and he told me it was Faithful. Oh, cried little Christian, I know him very well. His house was quite near to ours, and in review I should have mentioned that little Christian left the city of destruction after he learned about the heavenly city and Jesus from evangelists. And so he decided, even though his friends said, no, we're not going, he decided to follow Jesus and left the city of destruction. But back home, he knew his friend Faithful and said, I know him very well. His house was quite near to ours. How long has he been on his journey? And how long ago did he pass by, I wonder? Do you think I can overtake him? Oh, it was about a half an hour ago when I saw him, replied Watchful. I should think by this time he will be at the bottom of the hill. Oh, Christian was so pleased at the thought of having a friend to walk with that he determined to walk as quickly as possible in order to catch up with Faithful. But first he had to say goodbye to his new friends at the palace, who had all come down to the gates with him. It's a beautiful morning, said Discretion. Suppose we go to the bottom of the hill with you. Oh, that would be very nice, said Charity, and perhaps we could find Faithful there. I wonder why he didn't come in to see us. Well, it's early, said Discretion, and no doubt he wanted to hurry on his journey. I told you that the Palace Beautiful was built at the top of the hill Difficulty. The valley below was called the Valley of Humiliation, and the path which led down into the valley from the gates of the palace was very steep indeed. Christian was glad when Discretion took his hand and held it tightly in her own, for he could scarcely keep from slipping as he walked down this steep hill. I think it is as difficult to get up this hill and as dangerous to go down, he said. Yes, said Prudence. People sometimes have bad falls on this path. It was not long before they found themselves in the valley, and then Discretion gave Christian a little package of food which she had brought with her. We have been very glad to see you, she said, and I shall not forget to give your message to your father when he comes to our place. Little Christian was quite sorry to say goodbye, and when Discretion and her daughters had left him to return home, he felt very lonely indeed. The valley was quiet and cool, and he walked on quickly, hoping to see Faithful soon in the distance. But instead of Faithful, he presently saw a very evil-looking man coming along the path to meet him. The man was tall and strong, and his face was not pleasant. Excuse me. As he drew near Christian remembered his name, for he had seen him before. He was one of the chief officers in the army of the wicked prince, and he was called Self. He's one of the king's enemies, thought Christian, and he will try to hurt me. What should I do? At first he thought he would turn around and run back up the hill, back to the palace. Beautiful. Discretion might see him as he was coming, or perhaps Watchful might be at the palace gates and would send someone to help him. But then he remembered that he had no armor for his back. Remember, he had been given his armor at the Palace Beautiful before he left, but there's no armor for his back. And if he turned his back on self and ran back up the hill, he wouldn't have any protection. So he remembered that his breastplate and shield would be no use to him unless he faced the enemy. So he determined to trust in the king and go straight on. Perhaps, as he was such a little boy, self would pass on by without taking any notice of him. He walked on steadily, and in a few minutes self was quite close to him. I should like to know where you have come from, he said, stopping in front of Christian and looking down at his bright armor. Christian felt very much frightened, but he answered bravely, "From the city of destruction." "And where are you going?" "To the city of the king." "Perhaps you have forgotten," said Self, "that the city of destruction belongs to me. If you were not a little boy who can be taken back again, I should stop you right now for running away from the city without my permission." "I know the city belongs to you," replied Christian bravely, "but the king loves me better than you do, and I would rather live with the king." Then Self smiled. "Don't be foolish," he said. "I can be very kind to people when I like them, and if you will come back with me and promise not to run away again, I will not be angry with you. You shall live in my house and be one of my own servants." "I'm one of the king's servants," said Christian. "Oh, that doesn't matter. The king's servants often run away from him. Besides, you were my servant when you were at home, and you ought to be very glad that I'm willing to forgive you and take you back." Poor little Christian felt the tears start coming into his eyes, and his lips were beginning to tremble, but he answered, "I love the king, and I would rather be his servant. Please let me go on." But Self had made up his mind that Christian should go back with him. So he said, "Don't be in a hurry. Just think of all the trouble you will meet on your way. Our soldiers are up and down everywhere, and if they see you and try to hurt you, I don't suppose the king will take the trouble to help a little child. You know you have served him badly since you set out. You were careless, that you fell into the miry clay, and you let worldly deceive you and turn you out of the right path. Then you slept in the arbor and lost your roll, and when you came in sight of the lions, you were very, very nearly ready to turn back for fear of them. And yet, at the Palace Beautiful, you talked as if you were one of the king's most faithful servants. I don't know how you can expect him to do anything for you." Little Christian knew all those things were true, and he wondered how Self had learned about them. "I've been very sorry," he said, "and the king will forgive me. He knows I'm only a little boy." Then Self could not hold in his anger any longer. He had been speaking gently because he wished Christian to forsake the king of his own accord, but when he saw that his words of no use, he became very fierce. "Oh, I hate your king," he cried, "and everybody and everything that belongs to him. You are my servant, and you shall never go to this celestial city. I will not let you." Little Christian had scarcely time to put up his shield before Self began throwing fiery darts at him, and he feared that he would soon be killed by them. But the story he had heard at the Palace Beautiful of David and the giant came into his mind, and he thought, David had only his shepherd's dress, and I'm wearing the good armor of the king. I will trust in him and try not to be afraid. So he held up his shield firmly on his arm and caught nearly all of Self's darts upon it, until the wicked soldier became wild with rage and rushing suddenly at little Christian. He seized him in his strong arms. Those darts which Christian had not been able to catch on his shield had struck him and wounded him in his hands and feet, and his wounds were very sore and were bleeding so much that he was beginning to feel faint. Self saw this, and he flung the child upon the ground, thinking now he would be able to kill him. Little Christian had drawn out his sword from its sheath, but when Self threw him down, it fell from his hand. And as he lay on the path, he thought he had no chance of escaping his cruel enemy. But just as Self was about to strike his last blow, Christian saw that the sword was within his reach. He put out his hand and he caught it, and before Self had time to prevent him, he thrust it into the soldier's body and gave him a terrible wound. Now the soldiers of the wicked prince could not bear the pain of a wound given with one of the king's swords, and Self cried out when Christian struck him. Then the boy's courage came back, and he thrust the weapon at his enemy a second time, and after that Self fled away across the valley, and Christian was left alone. He lay for a minute upon the path, and then he got up and looked around. All over the grass lay the sharp darts which had been thrown at him, but Self was gone. Christian could not see him anywhere. It was the king who helped me, he thought, and his heart was full of thankfulness for his wonderful delivery. But the poor little soldier had been sadly wounded, and he felt so faint and ill that he was obliged to sit down upon the grass and lean his head against a great rock. He was weak and tired, and I think he must have fallen asleep, for he had a dream. He thought he saw his mother come to him, and she did not speak to him. But presently she laid him down upon the grass, and he felt his lips touch her forehead. He opened his eyes, but she wasn't there. It was a dream. He was lying by the rock, and he could see all down the long valley, but he was quite alone. He sat up and looked at his wounds. They weren't bleeding now, and they didn't even ache. I must have been dreaming, he thought, and the wounds are now all healed. Then he remembered that discretion had given him some food, so he sat down for a while longer and ate the bread and food which she had given to him. I must make haste, he thought, for I have lost so much time. I wonder if Self is really gone, or whether he'll come back to look for me again. And he said the soldiers were all up and down this path. I must be ready to meet them. So he kept his sword in his hand this time, and looked carefully from side to side among the rocks and bushes as he went along. It was late in the afternoon when little Christian came to the end of the valley of humiliation. He had seen nothing more of his enemy Self, and he was beginning to think that he might now put his sword back in its sheath when he saw two boys running toward him. Their faces were white, and they were mistrust and timorous. No, let's see. Let me see if it's mistrust. Their faces were as white as mistrust and timorous had been. And they came up to Christian and said to him, "Where are you going?" And Christian said to them, "Where are you going?" "Back, back," cried the boys. "And if you care for your life, you'd better come back with us." "Why?" asked Christian. "What's the matter?" "Matter?" they asked. We were going to the celestial city, just as you are, but we have been as far as we dare. Indeed, if we had ventured a few steps further, we should never have had the chance to come back and tell you to come back also." "What did you find?" said Christian, wondering what dangers he might have to pass through. That night he had no thought of turning back, for his victory over self had made him love and trust the good king even more. But he wished he knew what the boys had seen, so he might be prepared to defend himself. "Just before us," they said, "is the dark valley. But we saw it in time, and we have hurried away." "What is it like?" "Oh, it's terrible. It's the most dreadful place we've ever seen, full of darkness, and we could hear cries of people. No doubt they are pilgrims who have been lost in the darkness." "The way of the king leads straight through it," said Christian. "Yes," replied the boys. "Then I don't know. I don't see how we are to escape it." "Well, you can try it if you like," said they, "but if we get to that city at all, it has to be by some other way than through the dark valley." So they left him, and little Christian went on, keeping his sword in his hand. The dark valley lay much lower than the valley of humiliation. It was narrow, and the black rocks seemed almost to meet over Christian's head as he entered it. The evening was coming on, and the path was soon surrounded with a thick mist, so that he could scarcely see his hand when he stretched it out before him. Flashes of light kept breaking through the mist, but he did not know whether they were flames of fire or lightning, and the air had strange sounds which made his heart beat faster. By the light of the flames, he saw that the path upon which he was walking was a very dangerous one. On his right hand there was a very deep hollow, and on his left a marsh, and it was all he could do to prevent himself from slipping one way onto one side or into the other. I think that this walk through the dark valley was the worst of little Pilgrim's pilgrimage. Although he tried to think of the king and his goodness, he could not help being frightened. And in one part of the valley where some of the wicked prince's servants were waiting to trouble the pilgrims, a man came up behind him and whispered bad words in his ears. Little Christian could not see the man, and he was so confused that he fancied that he had said the wicked words himself, and he feared that the king would be angry with him. About the middle of the night, as he walked slowly along in the darkness, he heard footsteps in the distance. Some people were coming toward him, shouting and uttering things. He knew that it must be a band of the wicked prince's servants, and he thought, "They will hurt me. They might even kill me," and he wondered whether he should turn back, for he was becoming so frightened that his whole body was trembling. But he had already come a long distance through the valley, and he said to himself, "Perhaps I am not far from the end of it, and going back might be worse than going forward." So the wicked prince's servants were coming toward him. He was trembling, but and was thinking about maybe he should turn back. But he had already come a long distance through the valley, and he said to himself, Perhaps I'm not far from the end of it, and going back might be worse than going forward. Presently he found that the wicked soldiers had taken a different path, and he did not see them or meet them at all. And now little Christian was comforted in his loneliness by hearing the voice of a pilgrim who was repeating aloud some of the beautiful words which were written in the king's book. It was too dark for him to see who the pilgrim was, but he hoped it might be faithful and that he would soon be able to catch up with him. At last he called out to him, but although Faithful heard Christian speak, he did not know who it might be wishing for him to stop, so he didn't answer. Still, little Christian knew he was there, and he felt less frightened than when he thought he was all alone. Little Christian had no rest that night. He did not dare to lie down and sleep in the dark valley, for he feared lest the wicked soldiers, whom he could hear passing up and down among the rocks, should find him and put him to death or carry him back to the city of destruction. He was very tired, but he walked bravely on through the mist and darkness, praying in his heart that the king would watch over him, and after a time he thought of some words which he had read in the king's book. He shall give his angels charge over thee. Then he remembered the picture which Charity loves so much of the little child with the guardian angel. The picture was true, he said to himself. That little child was walking on a path like this, and the king's angel was taking care of him. Perhaps there is an angel with me now. I am sure you know that little Christian was quite right. The angel had been with him all through that dreadful night, and although the little pilgrim could not see his bright, shining angel, there were gentle hands spread out to shield him from the terrors of the way, and strong arms ready to hold him fast if his feet should slip on the dangerous path. At last, the mist began to roll away, and a soft, pale light shone overhead. Little Christian looked up and found that he could now see a strip of sky between the overhanging rocks, and he knew that the day was breaking. As the sun rose and its glorious rays streamed even into the dark valley, he stood still and looked behind him. The black rocks which surrounded him and the narrow track with the treacherous marsh on one side and the steep precipice on the other seemed more fearful now than they had been in the darkness. Little Christian wondered how he had ever come safely through such a dread place. Then he looked forward and felt more and more thankful that the sun had come, for he saw that the rest of the path was strewn, oh dear, with snares and nets, which the wicked soldiers had laid there to hinder and hurt the king's pilgrims. They had also dug holes in dangerous places and had done everything they could to make the road difficult and unsafe, so that Christian thought, if I had passed over it in the darkness, I should very likely have fallen and hurt myself. At the end of the dark valley there was a large cave in the side of the mountain, and in this cave two very powerful giants had once lived. Whenever pilgrims passed by their dwelling, the giants had attacked them and tried to kill them, and for a long time this was one of the most dangerous places on the way to the celestial city. But one of the giants died, and the other grew old, and his limbs became stiff, so that he could no longer rush out of the cave and or hurt the pilgrims. When little Christian came near to the cave, he saw the old giant sitting outside it. He felt a little frightened, but the giant did not move, so he walked straight on. The giant was full of anger when he saw him, and he would have liked to have seized the boy and drag him into the cave, but he had no strength left, and little Christian passed safely on. The dark valley with all its terrors now lay behind him, and just before him the ground rose a little. Christian climbed quickly up the path, and when he reached the top of the ascent, he found that he could see for some distance along the road. Not very far from him, a boy was walking, with his face toward the king's city. He was wearing a white suit like Christian's own, but he had no armor. He must be faithful, thought Christian, and he called out, "Wait for me, and I will walk with you." Then Faithful looked around, and Christian cried out again, "Wait till I can catch up." But Faithful answered, "I am going to the king, and there are enemies behind me." When Christian saw that Faithful would not wait for him, he felt vexed, and he began to run as fast as he could. He soon caught Faithful, and instead of stepping by his side, he ran on further so that Faithful in his turn might be left behind. But he forgot to look where he was going, and he struck his foot against a stone, and he fell to the ground, and Faithful had to hurry after him to help him get up. The two boys were very pleased to see each other, for they had been friends when they were living in the city of destruction. Faithful had always been quiet and thoughtful, and he and little Christian had sometimes talked together about the king's book and the wonderful stories which the strangers had told him or them. "I'm glad I've caught up with you," said Christian. It will be much nicer to travel together." "I meant to come with you," said Faithful, "but you went off so suddenly from the city that I did not know you were gone until it was too late." "How long did you stay in the city?" "Only 2 or 3 days. After you left, the boys talked a great deal about the king's messages, but I don't think they really believed them." "What did they say to Pliable?" "Oh, they soon found out where he had been, for he was covered with mud when he came back. They laughed at him and wouldn't let him play with them." "They need not have laughed at him," said little Christian. "They wouldn't have come." "No, but they teased him for turning back at the first bit of trouble. I met him the day after, and I was going to ask him about you, but he crossed to the other side of the street and pretended he didn't even see me." "I'm very sorry," said Christian. "I thought he would be a real pilgrim, and it was a pity that he went home again. Now tell me what's happened to you." "I didn't fall into the slough," said Faithful, "but I met a girl named Pleasure before I came to the wicket gate. She is a servant in the wicked prince's palace, and when she saw where I was going, she tried to make me go back with her. I was afraid she would make me, for she was tall and strong, but I would not listen to what she said, and at last she told me I was a stupid boy and wasn't worth even talking to." Little Christian remembered how he had turned aside when World deceived him, and he said, "You may be very glad you didn't listen to her." "Did you meet anyone else?" "Not for some time. When I came to the hill Difficulty, I saw a very old man sitting by the side of the road. He asked me whether I was going to the celestial city, and he said I had much better come back with him and live with him, for he would be good to me, and when he died, I would have all his riches." He was so pleasant that I could not help listening to him, and he almost persuaded me to go with him. Cried little Christian. He would have taken you to the wicked prince. Yes, I'm sure he would. I was just ready to turn back, but I looked up and saw that he was smiling to himself. Then it came into my mind that perhaps he was one of the wicked prince's servants. So I said, I will not go. Then he became very angry and told me he would send someone after me to hurt me. However, I escaped from him and went up the hill. Did he send anyone? Oh, yes. Just when I was passing that little arbor, I heard someone coming quickly behind me. It was one of the king's servants, and he said he had come to punish me for listening to the old man. His name was Justice, and I thought he would have killed me with his rod, but a man came by with a gentle face. And he said, Justice, and he told Justice not to strike me again. I did not know who it was at first, but when he was going up the hill, I saw the marks on his feet, and I'm sure it must have been our dear prince himself. I've heard about Justice, said Christian, but the prince does not let him punish the pilgrims too much. Did you not see the palace at the top of the hill? Yes, and the lions too. They were asleep, and it was quite early, so I thought I'd better keep on my way. The porter told me he had seen you, and I wish you had stayed at the palace. The people there are so very kind. Did you meet any one in the valley? I met Discontent there, and he was very tiresome indeed. Did you not meet Self? No. Well, I did, said Christian, and he very nearly killed me. The boys went on, talking happily together, until they came to a part of the plain in which the way of the king was wider than usual. Faithful happened to turn his head, and he saw that another boy was walking on the opposite side of the road. He was a fine-looking man, or boy, I should say, and Faithful thought that he might be a pleasant companion to join them. So he said, Are you going to the celestial city? The boy answered, Yes. Then let us walk together, said Faithful. We are all traveling the same way. I should like that very much, replied the boy, and he crossed over the road and began to talk to Faithful. He had a great deal to say about the king and his servants and his laws, and little Faithful felt quite pleased of having a new friend who was so good and clever. Presently he waited for Christian, who was walking a little way behind them, and whispered, Isn't he a nice boy? I'm sure he must be a very good pilgrim. Little Christian smiled. Don't you know who he is? He asked. No, said Faithful, I've never seen him before. Haven't you? Why, he lives in our city. His name is Talkative. He often pretends to be a pilgrim, just to amuse himself, but I did not know that he had come this far on the road. Is he a bad pilgrim, then? I'm afraid he does not love the king, said Christian, but you will soon find out. Then Faithful ran on again and walked by the side of Talkative. Perhaps, thought the little pilgrim, he's not quite as bad as Christian thinks, and we may be able to persuade him to keep going with us. But the more the boy talked, the less Faithful liked him, and at last he became quite sure that they could never be friends. It was plain that Talkative was very vain and foolish, and although he praised the king and said how delightful it was to be his servant, Faithful could see that he had no real wish to enter the celestial city, and that he was only pretending to be a pilgrim for the sake of amusing himself. Faithful listened quietly for some time, while his companion talked on about the king's goodness, and then he said, I suppose you were very careful to obey all the king's laws, right? Talkative blushed, for he knew he always did just what he wanted to do, although he was very ready to tell his friends that he did what the king commanded them to do. And he felt very vexed with little Faithful for asking such a question, and he answered him crossly, I don't think this should be a matter at all for you to be concerned about. But it does matter, said Faithful. If you talk so much about loving the king, you ought to serve him very much indeed. How do you know I don't serve him? Said Talkative. Well, I'm not sure, said Faithful, but I'm afraid you don't. I wonder what a little fellow like you has to do about correcting me, said Talkative angrily. I am much older than you are. Oh, I didn't mean to correct you at all, but I was not sure if you were a real pilgrim. A real pilgrim? Of course I am, but I know exactly how it is. Christian has told you lots of stories about me when you ran back to speak to him, and I suppose you believe them all. Faithful did not know what to say, for he could see that Talkative was very angry, and so he waited quietly, without speaking. I don't care at all, said Talkative presently. If you choose to believe bad things about me, it's your fault, not mine. But I think you are very rude and disagreeable, and I don't wish to talk to you any more. You can just walk on by yourself and leave me to do as I like. He seemed so angry that Faithful didn't answer, but let him go on his way alone, and waited for Christian, who soon came up to him. Never mind, said Christian when he heard what had happened. I'm glad he has not stayed with us, for I don't think it would have done us any good. Soon after they had parted from Talkative, the two pilgrims came to a wide and desolate plain. No trees grew upon it. There were no flowers along the path or among the short dry grass. The way of the king went straight through it, and as Christian looked forward, he felt glad he was not alone, for the path looked long and dreary. But with Faithful for a companion, the time passed quickly, and towards the close of the afternoon, the tired children were very glad to find that they were not very far from the border of the plain. Beyond it, the country appeared green and beautiful, and little Christian hoped that they might soon come to another one of the king's houses where they would be allowed to rest until the morning. Presently, Faithful thought he heard footsteps behind him, and looking back, he saw someone whose face seemed like that of an old friend. He stood still for a minute and then cried out, Oh, Christian, Christian, do you see who is coming after us? Christian turned also and clapped his hands for joy. It's Evangelist, he said. How pleased the boys were to see their good friend once more. Evangelist had much to hear, and he smiled at the eagerness with which the little pilgrims told him of all they had seen and done. Oh, the king has been very good to you, he said to them. You have met with some enemies and some troubles, but he has always helped you, and he will help you if you continue to trust in him. I'm sure he will, said Christian. Faithful only clasped his fingers a little more tightly round those of Evangelist, for he felt shy and half afraid to speak. But Evangelist knew that he loved and trusted the king with all his heart, and that he would be quite as brave as Christian if the servants of the wicked prince were to attack him. "Will you tell us more about the road?" asked Christian. "Will it be easier now, or are there some other dreadful places to pass through?" Evangelist looked grave. "I came to meet you here," he answered, "because very soon you will reach the gates of a great city which belongs to the wicked prince. It's a beautiful city full of all kinds of pleasant things, and many pilgrims, when they enter it, are tempted to stay there instead of going on with their journey. I do not wish you to be so foolish, so I've come to warn you about it." Why must we pass through it?" asked Faithful. "The wicked prince ordered it to be built on both sides of the king's way, so that pilgrims cannot possibly get to the celestial city without passing through the very middle of it." "What shall we do then?" "You must walk quietly along the streets. Do not stop to look at the beautiful things in the shops and in the market, and do not let the children persuade you to play with them. Sometimes the pilgrims are not much troubled by the townspeople, and sometimes they are treated very cruelly." "Will they kill us, do you think?" asked Christian. "They may perhaps put you in prison," replied Evangelist, "and they often have been wicked enough to kill people who would not serve their prince. But do not be afraid. If you have to die there, the king will send his angels to help you at that time, and you will see the king one day eventually." The sun was just setting when Evangelist told the children goodbye, and before its light had faded away, they saw in the distance the walls and gates of a great and strong city. "Are you afraid?" asked little Christian. "Not very much," answered Faithful. "The king will take care of us, and you have your good armor." "Yes, I do wish you had stayed at the Palace Beautiful, then you would have armor too." "Never not mind," said Faithful. "I'll keep close to you, and if the people do kill me, then I will rest until Jesus comes." He put on his hand in Christian's, and Christian thought of the king and tried not to feel frightened, but when he was only because he was only a little boy, and as he passed under the wide archway and heard the heavy gates close behind him, he whispered to Faithful, "I wish Evangelist were taking hold of my hand now." And Faithful said, "Yes, perhaps if we had asked him, he would have gone through the city with us. What a pity we didn't think of it." You know that the wicked prince hated the good king who ruled over the celestial city, and it made him very angry to see pilgrims on their way from his country to that of the king. So he built this city, which was called Vanity Fair, just beyond the dark valley and the wilderness, because he knew that when the pilgrims reached its gates, they would be feeling tired and faint, and he hoped that it would be then more easy to persuade them to stay instead of going farther on the way to the king. So he filled the great city with everything that was pleasant and beautiful. It had broad streets and handsome houses, and the stalls in its markets were covered with glittering wares. All day long the people were passing busily up and down. They wore fine clothes and spent their whole time in pleasing themselves. And the wicked prince took care to give them plenty of things to enjoy, so that they might never have a moment to spare in which to think of the king whom they had forsaken. After they had lived in Vanity Fair for a short period of time, most of the pilgrims began to forget the king altogether. And when they saw another pilgrim passing on their way to the celestial city, they were ready to help the wicked prince's servants in persuading the travelers to stay and to give up their journey. It was dark when our two little pilgrims entered the town, so they stayed quietly in a sheltered corner near the gate until morning. As soon as the sun rose, they began their walk through the city, for they thought that if they started early enough, perhaps they would reach the opposite side before the streets. Let's see, perhaps they would reach the opposite gate before the streets became crowded with people. But little Christian's bright armor and his white suit, and the white suit which Faithful wore, were not like the dresses and clothing of the children in Vanity Fair. And the boys had only gone a very short distance before they were noticed by some of the lads who were strolling idly about. "There are two little pilgrims," they cried. "Let's go after them and stop them." Christian and Faithful could hear the boys running up behind them, but they didn't look around. "Don't let us take any notice," said Christian. "Perhaps they will just speak to us." But when the boys came up, they all gathered closely round about the pilgrims and wouldn't let them pass. "Tell us where you've come from," said one. "And who gave you that armor and those white clothes?" said another. "Why don't you look for clothes in our shops?" said a third. "Boys like you don't want swords and shields. You should sell them and buy some more beautiful things." Christian scarcely knew what to say, for the boys were all speaking at once, and he felt quite confused. But little Faithful answered bravely, "We don't wish for any of your things. We're going to the celestial city." Then the boys laughed rudely, and one of them pushed Faithful so that he would have fallen if he had not been holding Christian's hand. By this time, many older children had run toward them, and some other people stopped also to see what was going on. Then one of the wicked prince's servants passed by, and when he saw Christian's shining helmet, he knew that the boys must be pilgrims. So he pushed his way through the crowd and seized them both by their shoulders. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Our prince does not allow children to quarrel in the streets." "We were not quarreling," said Christian. "We were walking quietly along." "That's nonsense," replied the man. "You have caused all this crowd and disturbance. You must come with me." "We are the king's pilgrims," said Faithful. "We are not disturbing anyone. We only wish to pass through the city." "I don't know anything about the king's pilgrims," answered the man. "I can see that you are two foolish, troublesome boys, and you must be taken before the governor." So he led them both down the street to the governor's house, and the children of the town followed, laughing and mocking the poor little pilgrims whom they had brought into this trouble. And that's the end of our chapter, and it's time for us to stop for the evening. I certainly hope you've enjoyed our story. Let me stop